Hello, and welcome to our final ADVizE mini lecture, where we're going to be thinking about how we can progress or think about these data skills as a progression from kindergarten through 8th grade. I'm Kristen Eric Thompson. Great to be with you. So, as we're starting to think about this, starting to think about how we can integrate data into our teaching, how we can think about this strategically across these grade levels as our learners are moving through, let's pause for a moment and reflect. Where do you want to include data skills in your future teaching? What's exciting to you? What's getting you jazzed? What's making you excited for these opportunities for your future learners? So pause the recording, think about that, and then come back. So working with data is a process, it takes time, and we can take a nod from soccer here in the United States on how we can go about this with teaching data skills. So many people, many kids all over the country learn to play soccer, from the wee little ones all the way up through college. The numbers obviously dwindles as we go through, but that's totally fine. But there are soccer teams at every step of the way along this continuum, from our very littles to our college, professional, and beyond players for soccer. And they play soccer each step of the way, but the complexity and the nuance and what we're asking people to do on those soccer teams changes over time as the players get older, as they get more practice, as they get better at their ball skills and their passing skills and their understanding of strategy of the game. And so you build in complexity, you build in what you're asking the players to do and things like that over time. And we can do that for data as well. Not only can we, but I believe that we should be doing that for data as well. So starting with our really littles and working up in a strategic way. There are a variety of different things that go on when we are making sense of data. And we've talked about kind of that working with data is a process, and that we have exploratory data analysis and explanatory data analysis. And we've been really focused on exploratory, especially the asking questions, generating data, processing, organizing data, and then visualizing data. Those are the 4 components that we've worked a lot on, but there are a few others in terms of quantify data. Data need to have units. Remember all the way back to that first mini lecture on what are data. Data have units. We also can filter, simplify, transform, decide which parts of the data we're actually going to be working with. All of those kinds of skills, those categories of skills, definitely fall in exploratory data analysis. Now, the visualized data can kind of go in between, because first we visualize to explore, then we visualize to explain. But a bunch of other skills, categories of skills, like describing and analyzing the patterns, interpreting data to learn something, evaluating the uncertainty within the data that you have, and using or building on the new knowledge that you gain from data, those very much sit in the explanatory data analysis phase of work that we do with data. So we can think about each of these categories as steps that are, or as components of what our students should be working on with data as they go through. And then we can think about, okay, so if that's the category, then what are the sort of individual tasks that our students need to do, or that anyone needs to do, to be able to accomplish that category? And we can spread that out of what the individual skills are to do the task for that category as we're working with data, seeing the hierarchy here. And we can spread out when we teach what of the different skills to set our learners up for success with that task. So this has been built out K through 12. A colleague and I built this out. We are just going to focus on kindergarten through 8th grade, and thinking about that. A couple things to orient you to this resource that we will be sharing out is that, as I said, sort of we've kind of set it up so that there's a progression from kindergarten through 12th grade on which skills to work on. And while these say certain grade levels, I want you to realize that that grade band or grade level is driven by a copious amounts of research on how our students developmentally can learn those different skills. Like, where is it developmentally appropriate for students to learn those skills? But what I also want you to hear is that we can really think of these as steps or stages or phases of building mastery of that task. And therefore, you might land in a sixth grade classroom in your student teaching or in your first teaching job, and you're looking at this, you're looking at your learners, and they aren't at all ready to do any of the skills in the sixth grade column. And that's okay, because that's an indication that, you know what, they're just a step earlier in their work with data skills. So see them as grade levels or grade bands, but also realize it's more kind of phases or steps as we work through to building these data skills over time. A couple other things to know is that it's a really big resource. We're going to talk through a couple of it here in the mini lecture, and then we're going to explore it more in the next session in class with your peers. But it's organized. There are a couple ways that it's organized to sort of help you make sense of the resource. And so the rows alternate by color. And that's just to help you see the difference between the rows. Within a row, if there is a cell that has a really different color, that is to indicate that that's a keystone skill. What's a keystone skill, you might ask? Well, you can think of it as this is the sort of crux of needing to understand these components at the core to be able to accomplish this task independently. Now, some of these show up for our really young students, our really littles. This is why we need to teach data from the very beginning for our learners, because somebody can execute, a learner can execute these subsequent skills, but not without a lot of hand-holding. So there's a lot of need for the teacher to provide support and structure and hand-holding, and our learners aren't very good at doing it independently, retaining it or applying it in new situations like state tests. So those keystone skills are really important. They are not the mastery level of the task. They are not what we would expect at the end if somebody is completely conversant and competent in the task. Instead, they are the sort of turning points of you gotta really nail these core components down in order to get the rest of the row. Sometimes they show up early, sometimes they show up in the middle. They never show up here. These are key foundational skills that our learners need to have all throughout, and they show up kindergarten through 8th grade. This is where they developmentally are appropriate to be teaching our learners. So we've built this resource out that you can look down a column, so down a grade band or a grade level, or that you can look across to see how it progresses over time, or how we add skills on to build that complexity, exactly like we do with soccer across the country, throughout the country for all of our learners. So another thing that I just want to mention is that you might be noticing that sometimes there's an NA, and that means that task, it's just not actually appropriate to have our really little start to wrestle with that task. Great. There's a bunch of other things that our kindergarten through 2nd grade students can be working on. And this isn't as relevant for us, as most of us are going to be going into the K through 8 space, but there are also some tasks where it's like, there's nothing new to learn in upper high school. We've got it all through elementary and middle school and early high school. They're going to get all the skills that they need. So I just share those two pieces as some context of why it is so critical that our students work with data and build their data skills from kindergarten through 8th grade. These are key foundational years to build out our students' skills working with data. So as we jump in, what you'll see in the table is that each of those categories has multiple rows, has multiple tasks, and then across the task, we can see how something can progress. So here, ask questions and consider possible outcomes. One of the tasks of that gets at some of these skills, where our younger students in step 1 are understanding that data are observations, counts, or measurements of something. This is a key component. That's why this is green. This is our keystone for this row, for this task. And then as we build, kind of step 2 is understanding that data as numbers or observations in a context. They're not just straight observations, but actually they sit within a context, and that we can build upon that to understand that our questions that we ask depend on what data we have or what data we can gather, and then we can build upon that to pursue questions that can be investigated with our available resources, or make sure we're framing our questions in ways that inform how we'll graph the data and analyze the data. So we can see we move from kind of the initial understanding that data are observations to then their observations in context, to then that influences what types of questions we have. And then we should really hone or refine our questions for the resources that we have available. So that's just an example of how we would progress through. There are other tasks as part of this, as you'll see in the resource in the next session. So for generate data, one of the tasks would be kind of at an early stage, we have teacher guidance, or as a group of students together thinking about physically recording observations. So this is the scaffolded support for our young learners. As they get older and move through and start practicing those skills, then we want for them to be able to explain how and when data are collected, not just the actual collection, but thinking sort of getting them thinking about that metadata of where have the data come from. And then we step into, okay, now you should be able to systematically collect and record your observations and measurements. And then we can build upon that to consider, well, so how much data should we gather? How much data is relevant for this context? So again, we're moving through. You'll notice that the keystone skill for this task is different. It's not showing up at our really early stages, but rather it's showing up here as step 3 for our 6th graders. Here's an example for quantified data where there's just not much work that we should be focusing on for our young learner students. But our upper elementary students, this is the keystone. This is the crux of, like, a crux thing that they need to master, that they understand that each time something is observed, it produces what we call a case. And that each point in a graph or value or bar or line is the value of that case. This is fundamental to understand the rest of the pieces of quantifying data. For organizing and processing data, we've been working on a couple of these throughout the semester. Here's an example where there are really important skills in steps 1, 2, and 3 in our earlier grades, where our students are recording observations in pre-made tables or lists, or designing the hand-drawn tables, and that it's not really until upper middle school that we get to this keystone that they can organize a data table themselves with multiple columns, that they can design their digital spreadsheets or data tables or databases, thinking back to that organizing data mini lecture that we had a few weeks ago, and thinking about, or a few days ago, however you're going through this process, and thinking about kind of, it's by upper middle school when we're really developmentally ready to tackle these meaty components of the foundations. So we've got sort of those components, and then we jump into our visualizing of the data and different components of visualizing. We have reading data, and we have reading data visualizations and creating data visualizations. Each have their own sets of skills, each have their own components that build over time as we work through kindergarten through 8th grade. All of our learners should be reading and creating visualizations. And then we might get to a point like we've done where we simplify, or we filter out, or we adjust some of the data to help us reveal the patterns or get a sense of what's going on, or just use a subset of the data that we are using. Same for our learners from the very first step, moving through, getting them comfortable and conversant with calculating total counts or subtracting minimums and maximums, and as we're moving into where they mathematically are learning about the median and the mean and the mode, and how that those mathematical calculations have a real live implication for data, and they tell us a lot about our data, and that's why we learn how to calculate them to make sense of them. And this key piece of describing and analyzing patterns, of getting a sense of what's actually going on in the data. How do we talk about what we see in the data? How do we develop intuitive ideas? How do we describe the properties or recognize that the values in a group usually vary? These different components. This task specifically has to do with variability. We're all working towards interpreting data to learn something. Now, this is an example of a task where the keystone skill comes in actually at ninth grade. But, oh, yes, absolutely, are every single one of these steps in steps 1 through 4, kindergarten through 8th grade, key to set our learners up for success to mastering that keystone skill in ninth grade? Absolutely, 100%. Getting our students to interpret data with this framing of we interpret to learn something is highly critical. As we're interpreting, we also need to become aware and understand that we're always working with a sample, like we've talked about. There's always variability, like we've talked about. Therefore, there's inherently some uncertainty because we can never prove something with data. We just support or not support with the evidence that we have in our data. So it's really important that our younger learners, not our littlest, but our upper elementary students, start to understand this framing. They love to think deterministically, black, white, right, wrong. So it's really important early on that we start framing and planting the seeds for understanding and evaluating the uncertainty. And this one's actually pretty easy because this falls squarely in the realm of fair and unfair, which is right where our elementary students are thinking about it. So making those connections to social emotional learning and their realities on the playgrounds or in the classroom and working with data can be really helpful. And finally, we use data for a purpose. We use what we've gained, or we build off of what we have gained with new knowledge to do something with the data. This is so important. The keystone skill is actually at step 1, helping our students describe a story or an idea that emerged from the observations and connect their ideas or decisions to the observations and or measurements. Key, foundational for them to be able to do all the rest of making sense of data. So these keystone maps are the keystone skills. We've highlighted those all up in an individual data in an individual worksheet within the resource. So if you just want to be able to look at all of them and get a sense of where they are, we have also included a worksheet in the resource where it's like, what is this row getting at? What is this task? What's the essential idea behind it? Because we tried to keep the title as short as possible, but then therefore that meant like some clarity got lost in the title. So the essential ideas worksheet is to give you a sense of what is this row actually getting at. And I've mentioned it a couple times, but we specifically call this the building blocks for data literacy. There are a few things in life that should be additive, but building our data literacy skills, our data skills, should be additive. It grows upon the work that's done previously in the previous levels. And so understanding kind of what is step 1, and then how do we build to step 2, and then step 3, and then step 4. But step 4 success is it can only be as successful as the foundations of step 1 through 3 going through it. So we've got this resource. We're going to dive into it more in the coming session, but we wanted to give you a sense of this is out there and kind of how to think about this more strategically K through 8, so that we're not all doing the same thing, but we're really trying to meet the learners where they're at developmentally. So I encourage you to pause the recording and do our last reflection of our mini lectures, which is, how can I use this to help? What kinds of things could you focus on? How could you make room for this focus in your future teaching? How can you leverage this resource so that less falls on your shoulders to figure out yourself and more you're using this resource that we're providing? Those are some good things to think about as we step into the next session, where we'll be diving into this resource even more deeply. Thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you for all that you will be doing for your future students. It has been great working with you across these mini lectures for the last however long you've been doing this in your semester. As always, reach out if you have any questions. Enjoy playing with your data, enjoy getting your students to have fun with your data. So excited to see what you all accomplish. Bye bye.